The sun rose gently over the city of Enugu that Saturday morning, casting a golden hue across its red earth and tree-lined streets. The city buzzed with quiet excitement as birds chirped overhead and the streets slowly filled with movement. In the heart of Independence layout stood Grace Temple Ministries, a magnificent church known not only for its towering spires and pristine white walls, but also for hosting the weddings of the elite. Today was one of those special days. Lavish floral arrangements framed the church gates while ribbons danced in the wind. A convoy of luxurious vehicles glided through the compound as chauffeurs opened doors for guests clad in the latest Ankara designs laced up with crystals and gold threading. Inside, the air was thick with expensive perfume, whispers of admiration, and gospel music floating from a live choir warming up near the altar. At the center of this grand occasion stood Reverend David Cole, the longtime pastor of Grace Temple. Tall and well-built, with salt and pepper hair and the voice of a man who had buried secrets and blessed unions for over 3 decades, Reverend David was a respected fixture in the community. Today he wore his ceremonial robe, pure white with deep blue embroidery, as he stood quietly near the altar, his Bible cradled in his hands. He scanned the pews, nodding at familiar faces. Business magnates, politicians, and old families of status. Then he noticed something odd, a few new faces, eyes scanning the church as if searching for something. He noted it silently, offering a quiet prayer. Today he was officiating the wedding of Elise Taylor, beloved daughter of one of Enugu's wealthiest hoteliers, and her childhood friend, James Nwoke. But as Reverend David watched James fidget nervously in his sharp white suit, something deep within him stirred. It was too early to name it, but he could already feel a whisper of unease. Elise Taylor was the kind of woman that made people smile when her name was mentioned. Born into a family of immense wealth, her father owned multiple hotels across the Southeast. But Elise had never acted entitled. Her mother, a former teacher, had raised her with humility and discipline. Elise spent her early years playing in the backyard with dusty feet and a best friend named James Nwoke, the son of a local tailor. James and Elise were inseparable until his family relocated to the UK when he was 10. No goodbye, no warning, just silence. Elise mourned the loss deeply, cherishing a small cowrie shell bracelet James had given her during one of their many childhood games. Years passed. Elise blossomed into a confident, kind-hearted woman who studied economics at the University of Nigeria and began managing part of her family's growing business empire. Then one rainy Thursday evening, everything changed. Elise had just returned from a business seminar in Abuja when her phone buzzed. A message on Instagram from a name she hadn't seen in over a decade, James Nwoke. Her heart raced as she read the message. "Elise, is it really you? I've searched for years. Can we talk?" At first she thought it was a scam, but the memories he referenced were too specific to be fake. They started chatting, then video calling. He told her he'd spent years under his strict uncle's roof in Manchester and only recently found a way back into her orbit. Elise forgave him easily, too easily, and within months they were inseparable. Their reunion was romantic, full of quiet coffee dates and moonlit walks. When he proposed during a charity gala with tears in his eyes, she said yes without hesitation. Love, after all, had returned full circle, or so she believed. Reverend David prided himself on being a shepherd of not just souls, but truth. During the required premarital counseling sessions, he met with Elise and James privately. Elise glowed with happiness, her eyes shining with trust. But James? Something about James bothered the pastor. He often deflected questions with vague answers. When asked about their shared past, he smiled warmly, but faltered under pressure. Reverend David dismissed the first signs as nerves. But then came the inconsistencies. One afternoon, he asked James what traditional festival he and Elise used to attend as children in Enugu. James confidently replied, "The Igbo New Yam Festival in June." Elise nodded, but Reverend David's heart skipped. June? The festival was in August. Later, after service, a family friend asked James if he remembered Miss Amina, the woman who used to sell jollof rice near Elise's old home. James smiled and said, "Of course, the one with the puff-puff stall." The group laughed politely, but Reverend David knew Miss Amina was famous for her fried rice, not puff-puff. He kept these details in his heart, not because they were damning alone, but because lies often wore familiar clothes. Then during the wedding rehearsal, James made a subtle but unsettling request. "Sir, do we really need to include the speak now or forever hold your peace part? It feels outdated, maybe even dangerous." Elise had laughed it off, but Reverend David did not. A man with nothing to hide welcomes the truth, even when inconvenient. From that moment, he decided to watch carefully. The days leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of final fittings, rehearsal dinners, and last-minute surprises. But the unease in Reverend David's spirit only grew. 2 days before the ceremony, a knock sounded at his office door. An elderly man in a well-worn agbada entered with careful steps. His eyes were sharp despite his age. "Reverend," he began, "my name is Mr. Nwoke. I am, or was, James's uncle." The pastor's breath caught. Mr. Nwoke explained he had seen the wedding announcement and something didn't sit right. "That man," he said, voice firm, "is not my nephew. He looks like him, maybe sounds like him, but he is not the boy I raised." Reverend David listened intently as the old man described a key detail. James was born with a star-shaped birthmark behind his right ear. It was as clear as day. If that man doesn't have it, he is lying. The room was quiet for a long moment as Reverend David absorbed the weight of the confession. That evening, he invited the couple for a final private conversation under the guise of prayer. As they sat together, he asked James to share one final childhood memory. "What did you and Elise always do during the holidays in Abakpa?" James hesitated, smiled, and said, "We always played at the Central Park with the big fountain." Elise smiled along, but Reverend David knew. That fountain was only built 3 years ago. The lies were stacking like bricks. The truth, he feared, was far worse than anyone expected. The wedding morning arrived in a cascade of colors and commotion. The gates of Grace Temple Ministries were wide open, welcoming a flood of guests in teal and gold asuebi. Security was discreet but present, arranged quietly by Elise's father, Chief Taylor, at Reverend David's insistence. Inside the church, everything sparkled: the chandeliers, the glass vases full of roses, the polished marble floor. At the altar stood Reverend David, watching, waiting. James arrived with a forced grin, waving to guests like a politician. But his eyes never stopped darting, and his shoulders seemed too stiff. Reverend David noticed it all, his heart heavy, but his resolve strong. Then Elise appeared. Dressed in a gown that shimmered like stardust, she looked like a dream. Her smile lit the room, her grace enchanting. As she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, guests rose in admiration. James extended his hand, his grin wide, but to Reverend David, it looked more like a mask than a smile. The ceremony began with prayers and hymns. Then came the pivotal moment. "If anyone here knows a reason why these two should not be joined," the words echoed like thunder in the silence. A cough, a creak of a chair, then a voice. "That man is not my nephew." The crowd turned sharply. Mr. Nwoke stood, hand trembling, eyes blazing. Gasps filled the air. James froze. Elise stared at him in shock. The truth was finally clawing its way into the light. The church was no longer still. Murmurs spread like wildfire as all eyes turned to James, if that was even his real name. Elise's face, once lit with joy, was now frozen in confusion and growing dread. Mr. Nwoke stood firm in the third pew, his voice louder now, resolute. "That is not my nephew. James is gone, and this man is an imposter." James laughed nervously. "Uncle, it's been a long time. Maybe you don't recognize me, people change." But the tremble in his voice betrayed him. Reverend David remained composed, stepping forward with authority. "Then there should be no fear," he said calmly. "James Nwoke had a star-shaped birthmark behind his right ear. Show it to us now." The tension was thick as James hesitated. Eyes watched every breath he took. Slowly, he touched the back of his ear and muttered, "It was removed. Surgery. I didn't like how it looked." Reverend David tilted his head slightly. "There would still be a scar." James shook his head, backed away slightly, panic creeping in. "Let's not do this here," he pleaded. But the mask had slipped. The smooth, confident man was unraveling under pressure. "Let us end the lies now," Reverend David said, voice steady and compassionate. "Who are you really?" The man at the altar sagged visibly, as if the weight of the deception had finally crushed him. "My name is Daniel Osu," he whispered. "I am not James." Gasps echoed through the church. Elise stumbled, caught by her father's firm grip. The dream had cracked wide open, and the truth was now standing at the altar, ugly and raw. Daniel stood like a man stripped of armor. His fine suit and charming smile no longer offered him protection. He raised his head, eyes red, and began to speak. "I met the real James in Woke in university in Leeds. We became close. He was the closest thing to a brother I ever had." He paused, blinking back tears. James lost his parents in a tragic fire. He was never the same after that. He often spoke about Elise, the girl he left behind in Nigeria. "I saw how much he loved her. She was his light." A few people in the congregation nodded slowly, drawn in by the sincerity of his voice. "When James died in an accident 2 years ago," Daniel continued, "I was shattered. I had no family, no roots, just James." He took a deep breath. "One night I opened his phone. I saw all the old chats, the pictures of him and Elise as kids. I remembered how badly he had wanted to reconnect. And then I made a decision. I became him." The crowd fell into stunned silence. Daniel's voice cracked as he continued. "At first it was just to fulfill a promise, to keep his dream alive. But when Elise believed me, I didn't want to lose her. I started to want the life James would have had." Reverend David stepped forward, his eyes filled with sorrow but not judgment. "So you pretended to be a dead man to marry a woman who loved him?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, I lied. I wanted to belong, but I never wanted to hurt her." Elise's face crumpled as tears finally spilled. She had loved a ghost and trusted a stranger. The church was a painting smeared with confusion, pain, and silence. Elise stood still, her wedding gown now feeling like a costume from a dream turned nightmare. Her hands were clenched into fists, her breath shallow. "You lied to me," she said softly to Daniel, but her voice carried like thunder. "Every day, you let me fall deeper, knowing none of it was real." Daniel dropped to his knees in front of her. "I fell in love with you along the way. That part was real, I swear, but the words fell flat. Love, when built on deception, collapses under truth." The guests watched in mixed horror and pity, unsure where sympathy should fall. Elise's father stepped forward, shielding her with a protective hand on her back. Suddenly, Daniel sprang to his feet and bolted toward the church doors, shoving aside a flower stand as he ran. Cries echoed through the building. "Stop him!" Two plainclothes security men, previously unnoticed, moved swiftly. They caught him by the arm and restrained him before he could escape. The guests gasped again as Daniel struggled, then slumped in defeat. "Take him outside," Chief Taylor said coldly. "Let the police decide what to do next." Daniel was led away, head bowed, his expensive shoes scraping against the tiled floor. As the doors closed behind him, the church was left with a terrible, heavy silence. Reverend David stepped beside Elise, not as a pastor, but as a guardian. "You are not broken," he whispered, "only awakened." And Elise, still trembling, began the first slow steps toward reclaiming her heart. In the days that followed, Enugu buzzed with gossip and sympathy. The city's most anticipated wedding had turned into a national cautionary tale. Headlines screamed, "Heiress saved from conman Groom," "Pastor exposes identity fraud at wedding altar." But Elise did not hide. She did not escape to the UK or retreat to a private island. She stayed. She grieved with her family. She wept through the nights. But she did not shatter. Slowly, like a flower through concrete, Elise began to rise. 3 months later, she stood before an auditorium filled with women, speaking at her first Stand in the Light seminar on fraud awareness and emotional resilience. "I ignored the red flags," she said honestly, "because I wanted the story to be true." Her voice was steady, not bitter. But love without truth is not love. It's a trap. The audience stood, applauding not just her words, but her strength. Elise launched the Lighthouse Foundation, offering workshops, counseling, and legal help for women defrauded emotionally or financially. Her pain had birthed a purpose. Reverend David remained a quiet mentor, watching her transformation with deep pride. Grace Temple grew even more respected, not just for its beauty, but for its boldness in protecting its people. Reverend David's sermons changed too, now laced with the urgency of discernment, the need for watching over one's spirit. True love does not fear truth, he said one Sunday, and the soul must never ignore when something feels off. God speaks softly, and wisdom listens. Elise listened too, not to old lies, but to the strength rising quietly inside her. 6 months had passed since the day her heart was broken in front of hundreds. Elise had learned to smile again, but her smile was no longer naive, it was earned. One sunny afternoon, she visited a rural hospital outside Nsukka to donate books and materials through her foundation. She wore a plain blouse, jeans, and no makeup. No paparazzi followed her. She was just Elise again. While helping staff unload boxes, she slipped on a step. A hand caught hers. "Careful," a calm voice said. She looked up into warm brown eyes. The man wore a simple volunteer shirt, dust on his trousers, and kindness in his smile. "I'm David," he said. "I volunteer here when I'm not teaching. You?" Elise blinked. No recognition, no Googling her name. Just calm, sincere interest. They talked for 20 minutes about the books, the kids, the need for better rural education. He asked about her work, not her past. For the first time in months, Elise's heart fluttered not in fear, but in hope. Weeks passed. Their conversations grew. Coffee became dinners. Elise told Reverend David about him one evening after church. The pastor chuckled, eyes twinkling. "You'll know real love not by the fireworks," he said, "but by the peace it brings." And so it was. Not a fairy tale, but a true beginning. One born from ashes, watered by tears, and blossoming in truth. Elise stood taller now, not as a victim, but as a woman who rose. She hadn't just survived betrayal, she had transformed it. And when David finally held her hand under the starlit sky, she smiled not because it was perfect, but because this time it was real. The end. What's your take on Beneath the Veil? Do you believe Elise made the right choice by rising instead of running? Would you have seen the red flags earlier, or fallen for the same charm? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about love, truth, and the power of second chances. And if this story moved you, spread the word. You never know who might need to hear it.